This lesson is called the corded ruffle and the baby ruffle. This here is the corded ruffle. This is the baby ruffle. And that's what we're going to be making. The materials you will be needing are some silk dupioni or satin or taffeta. It's entirely up to you. About a half yard or so will work. And a little piece of wool or two to sew the edgings to. And finally, rat tail cord. You don't need much, about a yard or so. So for these pleated edgings and ruffles, simple materials. You will cut 2 bias strips, about 24 inches long and about 5 inches wide from your dupioni. You will have 1 strip for your baby ruffle. You'll have 1 strip for your corded ruffle. Our first is the baby ruffle. Press the 2 in half lengthwise, wrong sides together. We'll start with the baby ruffle. This is a simple first step of stretching the folded edge, raw edge, folded edge. From here, mark a stitching line in disappearing chalk about 1.25 inches from the folded edge. I will gather along this chalk line using the method where we put Mara 30 into the bobbin. Next, you'll get to see the tutorial on gathering. When gathering fabric for ruffles, there are 2 methods that I rather like, and I'm going to show you both in this next little video. So there are 2 methods, the first of which is using your long machine basting stitch and thread. This is the thread that I prefer. It's by Gutermann, Mara 30. Mara 30 is it's essentially a buttonhole thread, and it's stronger than the shirring threads, so when you give it a good tug it doesn't break. Mara 30. I will show you how I like to use this. The other device, this is what's called a ruffler. It's different than a ruffling foot in that it has this particular part attaches to the needle clamp. This is what attaches to the shank, and down here is where the action occurs. So every time the needle raises and lowers, there are 2 little leaf springs that the fabric goes between, and every time it makes a bite. You can also adjust it so that it sews with makes a bite every 6 and every 12. So this is the adjustment, 6 and 12. So there you have it. This is called a ruffler. This is pretty much available for any household machine. I don't know if they have an industrial equivalent. I saw one once that was about $125. So what I would say is you can get this for not much money for your household machine, and it can be a ruffler foot. So these are the 2 methods. I will demonstrate how those work next. The first step is to wind the Mara 30 onto the bobbin and put it into the bobbin case. Then, as usual, you bring the lower thread up and you have the machine threaded. Next step is to loosen the upper tension. Don't take it all the way off, but loosen it about half of what you normally would. This will cause the thread to drop down below the bed of the machine, which is what you want. Next step, you're going to lengthen the stitch length all the way. I'm not showing you this that much because it's doing this little disco move, but you would lengthen the stitch as long as your machine will make it. Now, with our thread tension and the stitch length adjusted, I'm going to start sewing. I like to sew a double row. Hold your threads back. I try to keep the fabric flat while I'm sewing. You can let the thread do the gathering. Don't let the machine do it. So here, we're coming up to the end. Then we turn around and you can walk it 1 stitch or 2 stitches. Then we come back the opposite way. Now the beauty of this is that you only have 2 thread ends that you have to manage. So if you have to gather quite a lot, you can really pull and you don't have to worry about pulling the thread out of the stitches, which is so annoying. Okay, so here we are. Here we have our stitching, and you can see here, see how you really see the black thread? That's what you want, because that means the thread from the needle has popped below the fabric. And now we can just grab both of these white threads. Don't have to pull the black ones, just the white ones, the Mara 30. And you just keep gathering, and you can distribute the gathering evenly. Now, if you're working at a smaller scale, you can use, I'd say maybe a 3.5 stitch to gather. But there you go. It's a quick and easy way of gathering, and it's a lot more attractive from this side. There you have it, gathering with Mara 30 thread. Here we have the ruffler installed onto the machine. You would look at your owner's manual on your machine to determine how to install it for your particular machine. But the thing I want to show you here that you need to make sure you do before you actually start running this is the thread placement. You can see here, there's the thread. There are 2 little leaves here. But the thread, you want the thread to go down and under the foot. There you go, like so. You can see both threads are now under the foot. This is very important, otherwise it's going to hang you up later. Next, I'm going to show you how to run this. It's such a cool machine. You will just so love and want one when you're done. There are two little springs. One slides on top of the other, and that's what creates the pleats. So I use a stiletto, and the stiletto guides both, it guides the fabric between the two layers. Now you can see, if you look at the thread right there, one is on top, one is on bottom. That's extremely important. Then you lower the foot, and then the magic begins. You give a little tug on the thread to get it, to guide it through, but you can see the ruffler does the work. Now, the beauty of this is you can control how much fabric you take up in the ruffler by having it run pleat every 1 stitch, having it pleat every 6 stitches, or 1 every 12 stitches. Also, if you adjust it to the 1, you can adjust stitch length. The general rule is the shorter the stitch length, the more fabric you take up in a shorter, into a shorter length. So this is something I would say experiment with it before you really go with your real fabric. It is one of those tools that I find it impossible to live without. Next, I'm going to give you a close-up so you can see the different take-ups on this. So here, as you can see, are the different pleats. 1 every 6, 1 every 12, and this is a take-up with every stitch, but a stitch length of 2.5, whereas this here, as you can see, it is take-up of every stitch, and the stitch length is 1.5. So look, see here, look at how much fabric goes into that ruffle. So stitch length, the shorter the stitch length, the closer the little pleats occur, the more fabric you can absorb into a ruffle, whereas the longer the stitch, the less fabric is absorbed into the ruffle. So, 2 different ways of ruffling your fabric, and there you have it. Now, one thing you'll notice here, after you have used the ruffler, what you have is this fringe in here that's a little bit raggedy. So the object, what I'm going to be doing, I'll take it off camera and sew it, is you can trim all of this off and finish this with a pearl marrow. It's fairly easy to do. I will come back with the finished product. And we're back. So here you have, this is called a pearl marrow, or it's also called a 3-thread roll hem. Now you can just barely see right there where my thumbnail is. That is where the machine stitching that we sewed when we sewed it through the ruffler occurs. The object is to encase that stitching into the chain of the marrow. This way it finishes up the edge of this so that however you choose to sew it to whatever ground you're sewing it to, you'll have a nice clean finish. And here you can see the orange thread is in the needle, the white thread is the Mara 30 in the bobbin, and we pull the two tail ends. And sneak up on this. Don't just give it all a yank all at once. Draw it down gradually. It just looks better. I'll go off camera and finish this and come right back. And here we are. One thing I like to do after I have drawn it in is to tie these two ends together to keep everything from slipping out. So here we have the folded edge. We have the gathering. Now the beauty of stretching this edge is that it makes it a lot longer in relation to the base. Next, I will go over to the pressing table and press the seam allowances flat. Okay, here we are. Again, the folded edges and the seam allowances. So I like to hang this over the edge of the sleeve board. And you can give all these seam allowances a little bit of a pull to kind of flatten them out. And then press them as you go. I like to sneak up on this. Patience is rewarded when you're making ruffles. So next, what I will do is go to the machine and stitch over these seam allowances just to flatten everything out. Then we'll go back to the work table. And here we are. You can see the two rows of machine stitching that flatten out the seam allowance. Then you can come in here and trim and this is ready to install in your fabric. I like to hand baste the ruffles in place because I'd like to show you here, what do you do with this end? I like to just bring it down a little bit of a pleat. This will all fall in the seam allowance, so you don't have to really worry too much about it. But having the ends of the ruffle die down into the seam gives a better look. So that's, when we sew it, that's where it's going to be. Now when I sew, I'm going to run the machine stitching right up and just be very, very conscious of covering the stitching that I used for the gathering. Best way to do that is with the zipper foot. Now when you're sewing, you want to give the ruffles a little bit of a pull so that you minimize the overlap that you get. I'm just going to bring this down in here. So you can see all of the previous stitching has fallen into the seam allowance. And it looks like a crooked stitch because it's riding on the ruffles. Let's see. See how smooth? From here, you would put the facing on, your right sides together, you would stitch over here and apply the facing. So I will demonstrate that next. So you can see here, I have pinned the opposite side, and so we want to stitch ever so slightly to the left of the previous stitching. If you really wanted to, you could hand baste it. That's always good. But there are times that you don't have to be quite so accurate. In those cases, then, at this point, you could just pin. Okay, you can see that the stitching may wobble a little. Don't kill yourself on that. But the stitching is to the left of the previous stitching, which is in white. Now I will press it and show you the results. So here we have the baby ruffle installed into a seam. Lovely. Next is the corded ruffle. The corded ruffle is a slight variation of the baby ruffle. We have our strip that we cut and pressed in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and we have rat tail cord or mouse tail. So you would like a length of the mouse tail or rat tail a little longer than your strip that you're going to be installing it in. Because where this is going, just to give you an idea, we're going to set the cord into the fold and then stitch closely. Because what that's going to do here is it will pad out the edge of this strip, and then we'll gather it just as we gathered the other one. So we'll go to the machine. Here we are at the machine, and obviously if this were not a sample I would be using thread that matched, but since this is a sample, I'm using what's in the machine. And we have the, you could use any old zipper foot, I'm just using my favorite one because I love it. So what I will do first here is I'm going to lay the cord onto the fold, and then to begin I like to anchor just with one pin, because that way it stays put. You don't have to worry about it slipping around or pulling out in front of you, which is very frustrating. So now come in back here, and you can see the beauty of this is that the rat tail is a little bit firm, so the foot will ride against the rat tail. You don't have to worry about it pulling loose. You also don't have to worry about it flattening out. And then standard stitch length. And as you go, you just keep making sure that the cord sits in the fold. And I will continue off camera. Okay, coming up on the end. Okay, there you have it. And now we will gather the strip and install it into its own facing like we did with the baby ruffle. One useful little tip if you're going to be using the ruffler attachment, notice that I have sewn a stitching line where I want to gather, because you have two layers, and what happens if you don't sew the two layers together is the ruffler will ruffle one side and not the other, which makes a huge mess. So what you can then do is trim these seam allowances off. Now our strip is ready to go into the ruffler. To show you the results from the ruffler. Isn't that lovely? What I especially like about the ruffler is that the pleats are so even. I've already put it over onto the sleeve board and pressed, so installing is going to be a simple matter of sewing it into the facing like we sewed the other one. And here we have the results. The corded ruffle, the baby ruffle.